Hi, I'm Brian from HMD Labs, and today we're going to talk about one of my favorite subjects, code generators. Why? Since the beginning of computing, software developers, software engineers, data engineers have used code generators to radically accelerate their progress. You use code generators every day if you are a developer or an analyst. When should you do it? The sooner the better. When I get an intern, I give them articles about code generators. In the future, I'm going to give them this video. How to study. I think how to study starts with finding where you're already using code generators. It's pretty easy. We'll talk about the most obvious cases. And then looking for some pieces of repetitive work. Code generators are all about making developers more productive. So there's almost always some place in your ecosystem where you can find some repetitive work and you can begin to automate it in simple ways. And we'll talk about that. We'll build very simple ones, and we'll talk about much more advanced use cases. We're going to have a bit of a discussion about active versus passive. I think everybody uses passive code generators. It's a useful category. I think getting into the sort of blended active passive is a little more interesting. There's a big discussion about input model categories. You're going to encounter tons of code generators in your career. And really understanding one quickly and understanding which category of input it takes gives you a big insight into what it's capable of producing on the output side. And then we're going to stop there, right? So we've got some other subjects in the future. We'll talk about output diversity. We'll talk about reuse. Code generators are software, so there are entire sets of considerations around reuse. Extensibility is a whole conversation. We are going to talk about GUIs and visual modeling, case tools, ER modeling to database generators. And then we're going to talk about considerations for code generators in your SDLC, right? How does this impact if you're doing CI/CD? There's always conversations about generated code and source control, generated code and build artifacts, worth an independent discussion. So I made the assertion that all developers use code generators every day, that they've been with us forever. So a really brief history. This starts, well before I was born. I have some gray in my beard. So this is the beginning of computers. We have punch cards. So we have little pieces of paper and you take it to a machine and you use a lever and punch holes in it and you're programming the computer. And that's error prone and it's time consuming and it's frustrating. And so, some enterprising engineer says, man, I wish I could type something into a machine and then use that to punch holes in these cards, and then I could feed the cards to the other machine. Software engineers, oftentimes are kind of lazy, and this is the first example. I'm going to take this hard thing and make it easier. Text to punch cards. So the beginning of computers, we built what is essentially a code generator. We took some input text. We'll talk about this pattern over and over again. Took some input text. We ran it through some process. We got some output code that the machine could use. Jump ahead a bunch of years. We'll get to assembler, right? So we can write assembler code. We can multiprocessor-ish, right? Like you've still got to target kind of an instruction set, but you can write assembler code and you can compile it to machine code. Again, still a big productivity leap here, right? Let's jump way forward and then go down this branch. Because this is where we really, this is day-to-day exposure. Programming languages, generally speaking, whether it's C or Rust or Java or Python, JavaScript, TypeScript, all of those are just syntax to purpose languages. They run through a much more complex process on the input side. So they don't just go, input, basic machine, output. They tend to go input, lexer, parser, sometimes multipass. Sometimes there's a preprocessor in here, macro capability, like code that can manipulate itself. Sometimes you get to an abstract syntax tree, you go through some templates, maybe you go to machine code. There's a lot of depth in programming languages, and I'm largely going to leave it untouched. I think there's a category of source code generators that use programming languages as input that we are going to address. But if you want to go study programming languages, it's a great, pure theoretical computer science subject. So let's go over here. Simple config is our first input category. Simple config looks like rows, right? So maybe a CSV file that has simple definitions in it And for each row in that file, we're going to go generate a little Python file, right, that does some display. Maybe it's extracted metadata. So there's an entire category of code generators whose purpose is to generate SQL scripts. And they work by hooking up to an active database, right? So this assumes that you don't know how to recreate the database. You're going to hook up to an active database, and you're going to run a ton of metadata functions to understand the tables and the columns and all the the views, everything you can find. You're going to put that into a model. You're going to run it through a bunch of templates, and you're going to output all the SQL. And there's some fancy variations of this where you can run it more than once and do delta detection. But really, this is just extracted metadata, right? So a fancier version of this for sure. Moving over into fanciness, this is actually where most code generators find themselves. These are the easiest ones to write. They tend to produce really high impact. They have some limitations, but we're going to spend a bunch of time talking about this. There's a whole current generation that's there, NeuronSphere included. So that's the brief history and a bit of input model categorizations. We're going to talk about these 4 different kinds of things as inputs to code generators. And let's talk a bit about active and passive, like while we're here, and we're going to introduce our actors. So we've got a person and they have a bicycle, and there's some relationship between them because we've drawn a line. We're going to explore some variations on that line as it relates to data modeling and code generating. We've got to have people and bicycles, got to have something to talk about. Active versus passive code generators. I said it's kind of an easy distinction to make. Early on, this passive code generating categorization says, look, I'm going to go create a new source file in my project, and it should automatically have my license, and it should automatically have a certain set of imports, and it should automatically blah, 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 right? It is technically code generating. And, when you get into project scaffolding frameworks, so if you're in the Python ecosystem or in a lot of other ecosystems, you might have been the recipient of a package that was produced via a cookie cutter template or a set of templates. So we'll talk about cookie cutter as an example in this ecosystem of a really good code generator, really commonly used for your passive code generation, which is I'm going to generate once, and then I've got the artifacts, and I'm going to manually edit them. I'm going to check them into source control. I'm not going to generate again. I don't have a loop. We're going to spend a lot more time talking about active code generators where we're consistently feeding new metadata to them. We're consistently generating new outputs. We're figuring out how to apply them to our ecosystem. So a bit of overlap here, but a lot of talk here. That's the end of part 1.